Okay, so just as a quick introduction, just only got a couple of slides here really. So Ryan and myself host the All Things M365 Compliance podcast. So it's a kind of a video podcast, so you can watch it on YouTube and Spotify. And we cover really anything to do with Microsoft 365 compliance. Last about half an hour on all sorts of different subjects around Microsoft Purview, and often we have guests such as Peter joining us. So just a little bit about me first. So I'm Nikki Chapple. I'm a principal cloud architect at CloudWay, and I specialise in Microsoft 365 governance and compliance. So I live in this world of everything to do with Purview, everything to do with kind of teams and sites governance, and now even more importantly, getting ourselves ready for Copilot. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, and you can scan the QR code if you want to find out more about me. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Nikki, and thank you very much, Peter. So my name is Ryan John Murphy. As Nikki just mentioned, I was a Microsoft MVP before I joined Microsoft back in December of last year as a senior compliance technical specialist. I'm working with around 75 customers at the moment based on all things compliance. Prior to that, I was working for a company called Epic Global. And prior to that, I was contracting for 21 years. 7 of those years was around Microsoft compliance. And it's good to be here today. Thank you, Nikki.
Okay. So the purpose is today is hopefully to try and make this a little bit interactive. There's lots of kind of new features and functionality coming out, but we've all heard by now of Microsoft 365 Copilot and the wonderful things that can kind of help and support. But there's all those questions, and is my data safe? Am I going to overshare my information? And all of these other good things. So it's now really your opportunity. If you've got any questions, you can either raise your hand, come off mute, or you can type in any questions. Now, I know it's always a bit scary, isn't it, having that first question coming in. So like any good kind of, I suppose, cooking program, you know, here's the cake that I've made earlier. I've come pre-prepared with some questions. So maybe if we can start off with some of those, and that might help prompt people to kind of get engaged with us. So the first question I've got really is, I've got Microsoft 365 E3 licenses. How do I get started with Purview, and what should I do first? Because I know a lot of all of the really sexy functionality is all E5 or add-on labels, like everything with Microsoft. So if you've just got kind of the core E3 licenses, where would you start first? Any suggestions?
Is that to our audience or to us, Nikki?
Oh, no, so to yourself, sorry.
Oh, I thought it was to the audience. Sorry, Nikki.
Sorry, no,
I think Ryan and I were both equally confused.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, beg your pardon. So let me take that one and I'll throw it over to you, Peter. So I think first and foremost with an E3, the way I remember them both, right, is when you have an E3, to understand what you've got is you've got pretty much everything apart from the automation piece. So when it comes to E5, that's all your good stuff, all your automation pieces, all your auto labeling and so on and so forth. But a great place to start from an E3 perspective really depends on what you have for a company, what your industry is, what your organization is. But I would always say a good sensitivity labeling taxonomy, data retention and data loss prevention with the E3 DRP solutions is a great way to start. What do you think, Peter?
I completely agree. If I would have said exactly that, and believe me, so I can't really add any more to that other than I think that what Microsoft had a campaign a year or so back, probably longer, as the way time moves, about doing more with less. And not every organization is going to be able to justify that step up to E5 across the board. Even larger enterprises are going to have a mix. They're going to have some E5, some E3, some F licenses even. And that step up to E5 is going to enable those automation features that you referenced there, Ryan, and auto labeling and auto retention stuff. But those 3 things you mentioned, retention, DLP, sensitivity levels, excuse me, those are the 3 things I always say to customers: start there, get that right. And there's a lot of goodness in the E3 world with those features without a doubt. So yeah, can't disagree at all.
And I think that those 3 features are exactly what Microsoft are saying to optimize for Copilot. You know, it's all about making sure that you know, Copilot has the right access to the information that you should have access to. So simple things like creating the container sensitivity labels, you know, to control who has access, or, you know, some encrypted labels on content so they can't be surfaced to particular groups of people. All of that really helps, doesn't it? Not only for just good governance, but getting ready for Copilot as well.
Yeah,
Definitely. And one thing I'd add is a little tip that I always say to customers on E3 is that if you want to kind of get around the inability to do auto labeling, you can do some clever stuff like forcing users to set a label in the policy, or setting a default label. That's always a good way of ensuring that there is a label applied to content. So
yeah, indeed.
That was another question that I had on this list that we've had before is, you know, when it comes to this option of either asking people to label content or setting a default label, what's your preference? What do you think is the best approach?
Oh, sorry, Peter, did I cut you off there?
That's okay. I'll jump in though, because I always think in the nicest possible way, you can't always trust users to make the right decisions. So I like to set at least one default label, so we've got something there to protect them. And it doesn't have to be particularly restrictive. It can be just a general label. And hey, sometimes the label's even just a label. I've been working with a customer who have done that, internal general or something to that effect, where they're just applying that to all of the content, and just so they got something in place. And it's only the adoption of it is only as effective as the adoption and change processes that can be put into place with this as well, from the customer themselves, if they have those sort of resources, if it's larger organizations, and from our sort of organizations as solutions integrators or providers or whatever you want to call them. So yeah, but users need a lot of hand-holding, a lot of guidance, and we need to be there to support that. But I think there's an element of trust that in the early days, I would want something in place.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think from my perspective as well, having mandatory labeling or default labeling enabled can be either your best friend or your worst friend, given the scenarios that I've seen. I think if, like Peter was saying, it's great to have that default label applied. I think with the right policy to the right people, absolutely. But there has been times where, and I think me and Nikki have talked about this on the podcast, where I've gone to customers and they've had like a label applied to documentation, and there's like, I think there's 15 million items labeled with this particular label, which was their least privileged label. And then the higher confidential label, there was only a couple of thousand. And their remit was, well, you gave me that label to use automatically, so I'm just going to keep that label on the documentation, which works for some companies, but might not work for your most confidential types of industries. So just bear that in mind, I think, when you're thinking about default versus mandatory labeling, or both of them. Make sure you've got enough policies to support that. I wouldn't advise it to just be an all-on for everything for everyone, because you will get yourself into a tricky position where your users will just basically keep that label applied. It might not be the best output for you, but I agree with what Peter's saying. It does work. It is a massive value if you can scope it to those people that really need that one or maybe two labels, not 4 or 5, especially if you're using sub-labels.
Yeah, and I think that's the good thing though with the policies, whether it's sensitivity labels, you know, or retention labels, you can scope who sees what label. So if the majority of the people only need to work with 2 labels, only show them 2 labels, you know, keep it simple. And if you're working with highly confidential data, so for example, you know, you're in HR with personal identifiable data, give those people those labels as well. So it's having that appropriate thing. But I think also, you know, it has to come down to good user training. Technology can only do so much, and I think this is going to resonate the same with Copilot as well, isn't it? You know, we have to educate users. We have to make sure people understand the value of the data and the importance of having the right classifications.
Indeed. There's a question from Marcel actually in the chat.
Yeah.
Nikki and Peter, Which is a good question, really, because I get asked this quite a lot. So where to start when I want to get into more of the topic? So certification, information, learning paths, and so on and so forth. So from my perspective, I think the Microsoft Ninja pages are really, really helpful. They have lots of information in them, and they have a couple of like scenario-based tests on them. That's definitely a place that I would start, and I can share those in a minute for the whole Purview stack. Also, Microsoft Learn. I think Microsoft Learn, again, has some great detail, which is kind of looped into the Microsoft Ninja pages as well. And anything to do with the SC400 exam. What do you think, Peter? Okay.
Yeah, completely agree. Microsoft Learn is always my go-to when I'm studying for a certification. It's been a while since I've done one, actually, a new one of the SC exams. The only one I haven't done is SC200. It's sort of on my list, but I'm sort of in a role now which is ever increasingly less technical and more leadership and management, which is why I'm very happy to keep my hand in technically in these sort of things and that I do in the community to keep my knowledge fresh. But totally agree. SC400, MS Learn, you can get books from publishers like Pact Publishing. I know that I've written for a few times. I think it's Shabazz Dar who did the SC400 edition. I don't know if he's got a newer edition of that out now. Funnily enough, on my own YouTube channel, I have just started an SC400 learning path, which we're 3 videos in, and it's going to be a lot of videos coming in the next few weeks and months. So probably not a massive help to you now because it's incomplete, but a good sort of grounding in all things M365 administration, I usually assume people going for the SC content will have, but it's not always necessarily the case. So MS 102 is a good thing to have as well, and anything to do with the Azure basics, maybe start with some of the Azure fundamentals as well. But lots of content out there.
I think it's good to have the overarching view of how Microsoft hangs together, because Purview, you've got to understand, well, how does this impact SharePoint sites? How does the the Microsoft 365 groups, which are managed in Intra, and then you've got your Teams capability or your email capability, and you end up having to be able to understand how all of the different admin center works. So having that broad view of how Microsoft 365 sort of architecture hangs together, I think really helps, and then sort of going in deep. But I probably wouldn't start off to my first exam doing sort of like SC 400, maybe something like MS 900 first. Maybe they don't do the security one anymore, but to kind of do a broad view. And also must endorse Peter's amazing YouTube channel. So I think that really helps. So, just some of the Microsoft Learn, it depends on how you learn. It is all written context, but for me, I like to be able to see the hands-on, how does it all really work in a practical term? So they're looking at things like, videos and everything helps, or getting a test tenant. Nothing as good as trying it out yourself.
Yeah, for sure. And for those that are partners, you can actually sign up to the digital experience, which is the old CDX demo tenants, I think, Nikki, Peter, if you remember those. And you can literally get an E5 tenant with content in to actually play around with. Some of that content is labeled. You can delete the labels that are in there and build your own labels. You can run any discovery searches. There's already retention set up in there and so on and so forth. So they're great places to start to learning. So good shout, Nikki.
And on the exams, one final thing I'd add on this topic is if you've not done exams before and you do one for the first time and you don't pass, don't worry, you're not alone. Plenty seasoned individuals, including myself, have failed exams in recent time. SC 100 took me 3 attempts. So don't think that you're extraordinary if you don't pass first time. Just keep going, look at the score report and where you were weak and study up on those, and don't wait too long to do the retest.
Yeah, good shout, Peter.
And I think there's actually test questions now, which actually helps. That's quite new. Whereas before there weren't test questions. So sometimes the first time you went in and it's kind of how does the actual structure of it works. But now you've got the test questions, you get an idea of the different structure and everything. And there's normally plenty of time to take those questions. So I've got no more questions coming through in the chat at the moment. So I've got another question, particularly about Copilot. And, you know, people are worried about surfacing data that they shouldn't see. And one of the suggestions Microsoft are putting forward is to hide the SharePoint site from search. So you can do that on a site-by-site basis. I think people don't understand that if you're hiding it from the semantic index for Copilot, actually that sits on top of graph and you would hide it from the graph. So that would actually cause problems if the content is not accessible. So it wouldn't be able to see it from e-discovery, for example. You know, all of that searchability would be lost. So what would your recommendations be for somebody that's got a set of confidential data that they want to be able to hide from Copilot? What would your top tips be for that?
So I think in my perspective, it kind of works in a number of ways, and it really depends on the scenarios that you're working with. So we've had customers that have had that very same scenario. So they've got, we'll just exclude it from the indexing, not realizing it actually creates an issue in the background, Nikki. So what we are suggesting, or what seems to be a bit of a theme at the moment, is to have groups and sites labeling applied, and then removing the permissions for Copilot or anybody to actually, to be honest with you, not have visibility onto those repositories. That's one way that you can control that access on there, because what we have seen with some of the early adopter programs is those aren't in place. Lots of people have gone for the file and email, but many of them, many of them haven't branched out into groups and sites labeling. So for me, I think that's definitely one way of achieving that goal, if you like.
Yeah, I would agree. I think an effective labeling strategy, and we've had hints of this on some of the sessions earlier in this track today, about how important sensitivity labeling in particular is to, and DLP to the Copilot story. If you're sort of creating a PowerPoint deck from a Word doc and it's got that sensitive information in there, then it's going to pick up that label, and if you do it right. So this is why it's very important to get your labeling right, but for sure. So I think it's very, very early days. I think that as the story develops and Copilot gets more widely adopted, I think we'll probably see the controls and the guardrails become a little less of a grey area, and hopefully more well defined from Microsoft, because it's, I mean, we've had Copilot from M365 for less than a year so far, and so we've done so much with it already, and it's amazing, and it's quite scary to think where it could go. So those controls need to follow.
Yeah, because the semantic index creates a tenant-wide index of where a file has been accessed by more than one person. So, you know, having those container-based labels that actually control the permissions to it. And I think things like membership reviews. So in the Entra, you've got the Microsoft 365 access reviews. If you tightly manage that and only make sure people have the right access, if you can't see that team or that SharePoint site, then it's never going to surface that content to you because you haven't got the explicit permissions to it. So that's kind of one quick way, is if you've already got teams and groups there, you know, set up the access review process now. That may require Entra P2 licenses for the reviewers, but it would really help to make sure only the right people have access. Kind of a quick win. We've got some more questions coming through.
I just posted in. So, yeah, I mean,
that was right.
I mean, we're here to. Me and Nikki do quite a number of these, and we, like Peter said, we do have the podcast, and Peter has his podcast. So you feel free to just fire in any compliance questions that you have today. You know, one of the most frequently questions I get asked about Copilot is its visibility from an e-discovery perspective. That integration, that interaction, it's all there. You simply just need to go into e-discovery and target that. We've had customers ask whether or not using a specific sensitivity label to define Copilot generated information or summarized or interactive information is possible. Yes, that's also possible as well. And that helps you, well, it prevents you from what we say, or what we call polluting your data classification taxonomy, as we were just talking about. So if you've got general, confidential, highly confidential, and you want that to stay within the remit of hard-coded documentation, that's fine. You cannot just create a AI-generated content label, call it Copilot-generated data, whatever the case may be. That then also gives you the ability to retrieve that data in eDiscovery with the GUID of the label. So just some topics there to think about. Surely there's some questions. Oh, here we go.
Oh, we've got
Marcel
some.
again. Not a specific question, but more of a general fun one. What would your personal definition of the term compliance, and what do you think there are key points for a good compliance is? Oh, me and Nikki talk about this all the time, and I know Peter and I have had this conversation plenty of times in the past. So the definition of compliance really depends on what regulatory alignment you're under. So for me, when somebody says compliance, I'm already thinking about regulatory alignment. So GDPR, Sec 17 if you're financial services, and so on and so forth. But to others, it may be something different. It may mean ISO 27001. I know, Nikki, you've done quite a lot of that recently, right?
Yeah, and I think also some people think about it's just good tenant governance, isn't it? And it's not something that is it's something that needs to kind of overlap with security. I think security and compliance go together. Just because you're compliant doesn't necessarily mean you're secure. I noticed there was a blog post the other day. Somebody said, well, ISO 27001 doesn't mandate MFA. Well, no, it doesn't. It just talks in general terms about you need to secure your accounts. So you need to work with security hand in hand. And it's really about improving your posture, really, the best practices. It's all about minimizing risk. What are the risks to your business? How can we make sure that we keep our data safe? And I think that's kind of part of it. And it's not just technology as well. I think it's the people, the processes, and the technology areas of it as well.
And organizations are taking this very seriously these days. I think you'll both probably agree that in years gone by, not too recently, that it was hard for us, people in our sort of roles, to get the sort of interest in this, whereas customers are coming to organizations like ours now we need help with this. And it's not just a Microsoft thing, dare I say, it's wider than that. I mean, I work for an organization now, Insight, where we are vendor neutral. We are predominantly Microsoft, but we have a big governance, risk, and compliance team that I manage, a little sub team in my team that focuses exclusively on things like ISO 27001 gap assessments and NIST 2 and Cyber Essentials Plus, and many of our clients are doing mixtures of those and to get them where they need to be. All sorts of things come into play, and it's really, there's no one size fits all. Every story is different, but it's nice to see organizations, large and small, now realizing that this is important.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going off the second part of your question there, Marcel. And what do you think are the key points for a good compliance? And you've underlined good and made it bold, right? So I think you want to emphasize that point. So within Compliance Manager, there is actually a baseline assessment template that you can use. And I've just recently just had a brand new customer come to me with a greenfield environment, and they had the very, very, very similar question to you. I pointed them towards that baseline assessment template. It's free if you're E3, so you can literally use that to basically gravitas upwards from a good compliance standpoint. But what I will say is, depending on what license that you're using, well, it's not really dependent on the licensing, I guess. It just depends on how far you want to go with it. But from my perspective, I think, as I mentioned before, having retention in place, is definitely a key starting point. Number one, because data does need to be retained, and it needs to be retained for it to be discoverable, of course, and it needs to be retained for regulatory alignment. Then you've got the sensitivity labels, having a good classification taxonomy configured with sub-labels, and using groups and sites, as Nikki just referred to there from a Copilot perspective, is definitely a second target. And then the third one would be a proper DLP strategy, as Peter just alluded to prior, because having those three in place, you've really got the core standards of that baseline already implemented. From there onwards, I think insider risk management, communications compliance are definitely things that you need to think about from an insider threat perspective, but they are E5. And of course, the obvious one is having the ability to discover that data. So you can use e-discovery standard, which basically just gives you a dump and donate scenario. So you can do a search and then just dump the data out. Lots of customers use that if they're using third-party tools to do the review. Or you can use eDiscovery Premium, which gives you the full suite of being able to do all of those 7 stages through the EDRM workflow. Hopefully that answers your question. And maybe Nikki and Peter can add some context to that also from their experiences.
I think good is a very difficult word. It almost seems like it's kind of quite final, really. From my viewpoint, governance and compliance, it has to be, and I suppose risk. So the whole GRC part has to be embedded into the culture of the organisation. And it's an iterative process. It's not something to say, I've done good compliance, tick, tick, tick. I've done, clap my hands. I can go on and do something else now. It is something that has to be within the organisation. So I co-wrote the Microsoft 365 maturity model, competence for governance, risk and compliance, and that kind of baselines of where you are now and how you build your compliance stance over time. So if you've got very little now and then suddenly you want Copilot and E5 and all of these other things, it's a big jump to get to. Look at having an iterative process that builds on making compliance better over the years, but it's never going to be done.
Yeah.
And what I would say is a big mistake that many clients and customers that I've dealt with in recent years is not thinking of the whole story. They will come to us and say, we need to do DLP, or we need to do sensitivity labels, or we need to do this or that. And it's not just about that. And yeah, they might just have budget for that and be a specific team, but you need a good program of works and a good adoption and change methodology to diligently and correctly implement any digital transformation that involves Microsoft 365. So, a good example of that is you can protect your data all you want with all of these amazing features that we have in Purview, but if you don't have a robust and hardened identity posture in Entra or Okta or whatever else you've got, then the door's wide open. The malicious actors are one step closer to your data, which is ultimately what they want. So defense in depth is a big thing for me. Think about that wider picture.
Yeah, good terminology there. Defense in depth, something you really need to think about.
So just had a new question come in. So when you have a shared channel that you share with several other external organisations, and it can be a bit messy regarding labels, because the files that are created by external users don't have any label applied, even if locally we have requirements of a label. What are your tips to handle this?
So I'm just reading that back.
Yeah,
so
external people and even guests in your tenant will not see your sensitivity labels. So the sensitivity labels in your tenant are for your employees to label. So probably the best way, if you require labeling, then you really need to look at the kind of, I suppose, the E5 licensing suite, and either set a default label on the document library. So every time an external person or a guest creates a file, it's going to inherit that default label, or think about maybe a way of auto classifying content as well based on the content. But yeah, this is an issue not just with shared channels, but with obviously if guests create content as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Definitely.
I agree. I think I had some situation before I actually joined Microsoft last year, and they was in that particular scenario, Johan, and that was what you asked there was pretty much what they asked us, and we basically followed Nikki's example of applying the label to the SharePoint library. Any documentation that was created in there had that label applied to it, of course. In another scenario, we provided them with a dedicated SharePoint site, and we basically created a sensitive information type of a customer ID number that they had to use in each of the documentations that they created. And therefore, then after the fact, it was detected, the auto label applied to that, but you would need an E5 for that as well. Hopefully that helps.
So no, definitely with this scenario, the default label, I did one with encryption as well. So it was with guests. It wasn't a shared channel, but it was guests in a team, and the encrypted label was scoped so that the members of the team, which include the guest members, had access to that encrypted content. So if you're a member of the team, you could access it, and that was the default label. Once you were removed from the team, then you lost access as well. So you can do that sort of encryption with external people as well, but you do need to scope it correctly.
Yeah.
I have a little question, if you don't mind, actually, just if we're finished with this particular topic, is have either of you seen much traction or interest in the way of Microsoft Priva, if it's even still called that? I think it might just be privacy management in the portal now when I last looked, but I've really not come across any customers using it, and I wonder if you see any where the value is.
Do you want the blunt answer, Peter? No.
Yes, please.
No. So I think I'm a massive advocate of eDiscovery Premium, and you know, I'm actually a compliance champ for it inside of Microsoft, based on my knowledge of it. And I think if you've got eDiscovery Premium, Priva in the background uses a lot of that technology, a lot of those engines and so on and so forth. I think the only added benefit is the Content and Activity Explorer. What I will say is, if DSARS is something that you do a lot of, and I'm talking, you know, maybe 10, 15, 20 of them a day, Priva can get very, very expensive very, very quickly. But it may be within remit for you to do that as a business. I know we've had some retail customers just not use eDiscovery Premium, just move to Priva and adopt it that way. But on the flip side, most of the industries that I work with, they will have eDiscovery Premium because of the advanced indexing that's available on it. It's necessary for them to do a search against that advanced indexed items, as Nikki were mentioning before. Therefore, they have to use that from a regulatory perspective or even a ombudsman perspective, so on and so forth. They don't see any value in Priva whatsoever because they can essentially just do whatever they need to do via KQL search in eDiscovery. Hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, so it'd be interesting to see where Microsoft go with Priva in the long term, whether they refine it, persist with it, or integrate it more tightly into eDiscovery. I wait with interest.
Yeah, I do see there's value in it, and I think we spoke about this quite a while ago, didn't we, Nikki, on another session? I think I do see, for those that need it, who do a lot of DSARS, it's a value, but it's very expensive. Those types of customers wouldn't apply a E5 license to their users. They would just be sat happy on an E3. So it really works its way around in circles, but I would like to see some more of that integration on eDiscovery Premium, as you mentioned, Peter, just to give you those insights around that data before doing that search. Any more questions? Oh, sorry, Nikki, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, if anyone's got any questions, feel free. If you want to put your hand up, more than happy to take you off mute if you've got any questions.
And I've just shared some of the Ninja training as well. So take a look through those. As I mentioned at the beginning, I really find them useful. And even for the likes of me, who may be called a seasoned compliance person like Nikki and Peter, when going through these, because the technology is always evolving, sometimes you can get lost in the updates and on the roadmap. So there might be things that come through that you miss. These training sessions, excuse me, they really do link into, you know, the capabilities of the tool sets. And I've even gone through, even the eDiscovery one, I've gone through the eDiscovery one and learned a couple of things on my way through there. So they are a benefit. And the additional benefit is they go from level 100 to 400. So it doesn't just throw you in at the deep end and it basically say, write me a KQL query to go and find a SharePoint path or whatever the case may be. It gradually builds you up into that knowledge. And it's not something you can race through like some of the Microsoft Learn topics. And a lot of them have Microsoft Learning. And what I like about it is, and I'm sure Peter and Nikki will say the same, at the end of each subject or topic, there's about 5 or 6 questions just to do a knowledge check before you move on. I found that incredibly benefit at times, and it's kind of like a sample exam, if you like, Peter.
Yeah, definitely. Totally agree. I think that that process is wonderful and a great way to learn and get ready for the test and certification. So here's another question for you both, which has just come to mind. Something that I often think about myself is within the wonderful Microsoft Purview portal that we've all got to know and love over recent years, what would you say are the unsung heroes, the underappreciated features that you kind of wish that customers got a little bit more but are not as adopted as they maybe should be?
Oh, for me, it's got to be Discovery Premium. I think it's massively underutilized in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. In the US, it's so aggressively adopted. I think eDiscovery Premium is essentially Microsoft's, within the Purview portal, I think it's Microsoft's second best product away from sensitivity label. That's my own personal opinion. Nikki?
I personally like adaptive scopes.
Mm.
So this is again something that you have to have the E5 licenses for, but people tend to retain data longer than they should, and having retention policies that go on a SharePoint site or on a mailbox is simple for people to grasp. But it's fine if you want to treat everything the same. I want to keep all my emails for 7 years, or I want to keep all my sites. But as soon as you start having different jurisdictions or different values of data where you want to keep them for different types, trying to manually do that with retention policies, you've either got to add in people's mailboxes or add in SharePoint sites. It becomes an admin nightmare. You set it up once and within a week it's out to date. So having that ability to create the adaptive scopes and then use the user properties to say, everyone in UK has adaptive scope, UK user, everyone in the US has something else. And then as long as you've got the good joiner movers levers process, that will keep up to date. And the other part is then writing information to the property bag of the SharePoint site. So rather than just trying to work out from the SharePoint URL what it's about, and if you don't have a naming standard, that becomes impossible. If you can write the metadata to the property bag, which you can then map to a refinable string so it's searchable, you can then use that. So as part of any kind of like Teams route and site provisioning process, I always capture that metadata, always get it written to the sites. You can write it to groups, etc. Then you're ready. Even if you haven't got E5 licenses, when you're ready for them, you've got that segmentation there. And I know Microsoft are thinking about using that wider than just retention capabilities. So I think we'll see that more and more, actually, that ability to segment.
I agree with that, Nikki. And I think adaptive capabilities, not something I've looked too deeply into in recent times, but wasn't there advances with that in DLP not that long ago? Something similar coming into DLP, there wasn't there? Yeah. I must look into that a little bit more because I've not really played with it yet. But for me, there's a couple that I think that I really love that I don't see an awful lot of use of with my customers. Is that's exact data match and document fingerprinting. I think they are wonderful. I mean, as one of the speakers on this track this morning was saying, I forget who it was now, it might have been Tattoo. EDM requires a lot of in-depth knowledge to set up and get it right. Document fingerprinting, not so much. I think it's very easy to get up and running, but I'd love to see that used a bit more across M365 customers.
Yeah, I'm going to throw a curveball in here as well, because I think another massively underutilized product, which is specifically a security product, which annoys me, is Sentinel. I think the advanced logging, monitoring, and alerting you get from Sentinel on the Purview stack is incredible. I mean, you just talk about going into Activity Explorer and understanding an activity from a label. So if Peter labels an item and then I have permissions to change that label, and then Nikki has permissions to change that label, all that information is there in Activity Explorer, but trying to sew all that together is such a task. With a simple KQL query in Sentinel, you can bring that back in seconds, literally seconds, and have that pushed out to a Power BI report, which we did recently for a customer. The added benefit of it is you can track immutable items in data lifecycle management and records management if you want to. You can understand who's creating policies or in adaptive scopers. Nikki's just alluded to. You can see triggers and alerts from IRM and communications compliance. You can also manage your full e-discovery estate, so you can understand if Peter created a case and added myself and Nikki in, what data sources he'd added in, even down to the point of what query text he used against that search collection. I think because it does come under that security stack, people don't really look at it from any other perspective. But if any of your customers have Sentinel in and they want some advanced logging, monitoring, alert when it comes to purview, get into Sentinel, because I tell you now, it will give you a lot more information, a lot quicker and a lot easier than the unified audit log.
Agreed. And something that's looming, and no release date firm for it yet, is Security Copilot, which is just going to add such value to Sentinel and Purview. And I so wish I could say more about it, but certainly can't right now. But that's going to be awesome. It really is.
And I think from the Purview stack as well. Oh, sorry, Nikki, I'll just finish off.
No,
if I don't say it it's in my head, it's gone. So I think I was actually in Redmond last week, and I was with the Security Copilot team, and they have a plethora of ideas for Purview. So if your customers don't use Sentinel, but they do use Security Copilot, then you can kind of cover off some of those Purview related scenarios when it comes to labeling and so on and so forth. So that's a very, very good point, Peter. There are some incredibly exciting times coming out with Security Copilot, which will have a data connector for Purview, or a connector for Purview, should I say? Keep away from the Sentinel terminology, Ryan, which will have a connector for Purview. So you can definitely take advantage of that. And I promise you now, anybody that's using Security Copilot will get huge benefits, not just on the security stack, but also on the Purview stack.
And that will be an additional license to the Microsoft 365 Copilot, just to make it clear. There's lots of different Copilots, so that will not be included if you've got Microsoft 365 Copilot. We're talking about an additional product now. But when you've got so many data points, you think of the millions of data points that are being created all the time by the audit logs. You know, it's just overwhelming. So I don't know how to use Sentinel, and I haven't got my connector hooked it up. So I needed to look at file sharing for a company, and I couldn't even export out 1 month's worth of data, just filtered in some particular, file sharing activities, because it hit the boundaries of what could be exported by Excel. And it takes a lot of time to start analysing those data. But yeah, I can really see once kind of that Copilot comes in, you'll be able to add the natural language prompts. I could see it being really valuable in e-discovery as well.
Yeah.
About some of the filtering.
Yeah, for sure. I think also, it's really good from that perspective, Peter, because you could do a summarization of, like, let's take insider risk management, for example, right? So you've had an alert come through, you've escalated that into an investigation, but you want to be able to summarize what all that data set is about. Now, you can get that, of course, from the alerts, but it might not be in as plain English as you need it. So when you flip that over into Security Copilot and get it into an e-discovery case, you can basically summarize the data that's been brought back and summarize the actual users and the data that they've interacted with. That gives you that summarization. And as Nikki said there, you can literally say, okay, now create me a KQL query, which is the keyword query language, not custom query language, which is with Sentinel, which everybody gets confused about, even myself at times.
Yeah.
What it will do is it will take that content of what you got and take the context of it based on the summarization and give you that keyword query language. Now, I've used it a number of times, and to be fair, sometimes depending on how big the case is, and I have some massive cases, it can kind of miss things off, but it's a language in learning, as we say. But some of the shorter ones, some of the more like to the point ones where bring me back this modern attachment, do a search against Peter and Nikki for these keywords against these dates, against these repositories, it's 100% valuable from that perspective. And I've also found as well, I can feed it some of the KQL queries that I've created in the past, and it fine tunes them. It really does make a massive difference. So I think that's a great addition, especially for anybody that's new to eDiscovery Premium and KQL.
I really wish they would rename one of those KQLs.
yeah, I do. I remember being in a conversation by a third party on Twitter, by a third person on Twitter. Somebody was asking for KQL for e-discovery, but they published it in the Sentinel channel. But what he wanted was keyword query language, and nobody could understand what he was asking for. And somebody just randomly tagged me in it because it was e-discovery, and I thought, oh, he's asking for keyword query language, not custom query language. So I completely agree with you, Peter. They need to change that wording a little bit. I'll give one of them an additional initialization or something.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, a renaming like that can be really powerful. I mean, Entra is a great example. I mean, there was the predictable backlash when that first happened, Entra ID instead of Azure AD, but I think it's firmly established now, and I think it made perfect sense when you consider people used to get so confused about, well, what's the difference between Azure and Azure AD, and what's the difference between Azure AD and AD, and so much confusion. I think it's really just made things very clear.
Yeah, we could put that little E in front of the KQL as we do for e-discovery. That would make it a lot more understandable, I think.
Absolutely.
I know we're nearly at time, so I've just got a question that just came out in the news recently. It was, I can't remember, I think one of the Canadian Airlines and their chatbot. Don't know whether people are aware of it, that they had a chatbot to help people.
Yes.
I think there was they had a bereavement policy. So I think the process was that, you know, if you needed to do urgent travel or whatever, you can get some sort of discounted fare. So they put into the chatbot that, you know, what the bereavement policy is, and the chatbot told them, don't worry, buy your flight and then you can claim back the discount afterwards, because, you know, we know it's urgent. So they followed along and they'd taken a screenshot of the prompt, but then when they tried to claim the discount, the company came back and said, oh, it's a chatbot, and the chatbot is its own company, and it's got nothing to do with the company. So that got actually thrown out of court, didn't it, to say that actually the company had to be responsible for the responses coming back. And I think their chatbot has now vanished. So kind of really from a compliance standpoint and viewpoint, what should we be considering if we're starting to use some of these AI type things for some decisions, for example, e-discovery searches or various other things, and making judgments when it's based on AI?
So I think if anybody's not connected with him, Rod Trent, have you heard of him, Nikki, Peter? So Rod Trent has some great information on AI and compliance. Some really good blogs. But that's a great example. And I actually read that when I was in Seattle, and it did make me think a little bit of the responsibilities. And I think there was somebody else as well that had a very similar situation where, was it DHL or someone, where the prompt was not as friendly as they expected it to be, let's say. Does anybody remember that one? Was it DPD or DHL? No.
Not one I come across.
No, I'll try and dig it out and share it for you. But somebody had asked a question, and it basically weren't that friendly on its reply. So let's just leave it as that. But sorry, Nikki, what was your question again?
What things do we need to do? I mean, I know, Ryan, you mentioned earlier about the capability you could create a sensitivity label and say generated by AI or something.
Yeah.
But do you think that we're going in the future going to have this need that these documents or contents that are being generated by AI need to be almost but the owner of it? So rather than if I create a document, I'm the owner, and then Ryan, if you edit it, your name is also stamped on there. But we almost need like an AI persona to say this document was created by AI and wasn't necessarily created by Nikki. So you can kind of track where things have been sourced from.
Yeah, definitely. And look, that particular scenario of using an independent label to basically label content that's generated by Copilot came from a huge bank, and their legal team basically said you have to make sure that they're separate, because we can't essentially make you, Nikki, liable for something that Copilot has generated if you put that into a document and share it with a customer, or it breaches IPO rules, which is initial public offering, because they're an investment bank. So they wanted to basically ensure that there was no legality on the end user, and it was all down to the engine. Now, if it was down to the engine, yes, they're responsible for checking that documentation before it's sent out. But if it isn't, and it's released because they had some third-party systems where the document generates and then sends it out, if that would ever be the case, then the bank wouldn't be liable for that documentation if they had that separation of documentation when it comes to the label. The other point on that as well for them was they didn't want to pollute their already matured sensitivity labeling taxonomy and the documentation that they had. They're very comfortable with where that is, and that's a manual process that the user goes through. The last thing they wanted is for Copilot to go rogue, if you could ever use that word, and basically just start labeling everything it possibly can that hasn't already been labeled. Now, manual labeling always wins. If it's already been labeled, Copilot won't override it. But if there's ever a case where somebody creates something and it has a generic feel to it, and Copilot goes and labels the rest of it when it literally is different types of IPOs or different types of documents, then I definitely think that you've got to have some type of standardized way of working. But as this more matures, I do think there'll be more industries like the health industry, maybe the legal industry themselves, that come out and say, okay, there's a fine line between what we've got here from a user creation and a Copilot creation. Let's ensure that we have separate retention policies. Let's ensure that we have separate sensitivity labels, because as I mentioned prior, if you're running a new discovery case, you just need the grid of the retention label and the grid of the sensitivity label, and you can bring all of that AI generated content back and differentiate between Peter created it or Copilot created it. Hopefully that answers your question.
Oh, wow. Early days with this, it's going to run and run, isn't it? And we're going to see this story develop over the next months and years for sure. But amazing. I think, folks, that this has been awesome. I could talk. I know you could as well for hours and hours about this, but we're going to have to call it a day on our session. And I thank you so much, Nikki and Ryan, for that amazing discussion, and Nikki especially for covering me first thing this morning on room 2 here. It's been a wonderful day. There's more to come. Please do rate this session. I'll put the link to the rating link in the chat there for you right now. And end of the day for room 2, as I say, but there is more to come in the other rooms and the final ending keynote as well. So let me just share the screen very briefly so you can see what we have coming up in the next hour. So Joy, Apple and Jay, at least that's going to be a really good one. Governance, information management, what's stopping you? Room 2, we're done. Laura in room 3, Battle of the Forms versus Teams. I want to catch so much of this content when it's on YouTube. Daniel Christian, great guy. He's got a great YouTube channel, Dataverse in Teams, worth checking out. Estelle, I'm going to be doing something with Estelle and a couple of others next week about neurodiversity, actually. So what's that one? Elevating Teams Dynamics for Microsoft Teams, and OpenAI. And April, always worth watching when April has something to talk about. 5 ways to improve your Power Apps. So, God, how do you choose? What a great lineup our wonderful organizers have had for us on Teams Nation today. It's so good to see it back. But that's about it from us. Thank you again, Nikki. Thank you, Ryan. I will look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. But let's finish this one up and head over to some of those other wonderful sessions, and we will see you again